Hello and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Fundamentals of Reserves. Today's class is approved for 1 hour of continuing education credit in either the Insurance and Financial Management section or as an elective. If you haven't already provided us with your first name, last name, and CAM license number, please be sure to do so. Otherwise, we won't be able to get you credit for today's class. Now, with that said, I don't want to give the impression that this course is only for managers. Board members, committee members, and residents will also learn a great deal about reserve budgeting and planning and come away better prepared to lead and serve their communities. Also, we'll be glad to provide copies of the slides from today's presentation, so please don't hesitate to ask if you'd like to get a copy of those slides by email. Before I begin the class, I want to take a moment to introduce myself and our company in a little more detail. My name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008, and I've spent most of my career in Florida, where we've had clients going back to the early 1990s. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist, and that's an industry-specific credential that is only awarded to people who have demonstrated their expertise and experience in preparing reserve studies. It's a designation awarded by the Community Associations Institute, or CAI, and there have only been a few hundred people to ever earn that credential over the last 20 plus years. I've lived in both condos and HOAs, and I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer of my own community in South Florida, where I oversaw a budget of over $1 million. The reason I point that out is because I know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, having to work with volunteer board members and committees who are collectively taking on the responsibility of managing their associations, which in some cases can represent hundreds of people and many millions of dollars worth of property value. So, who is Association Reserves? Put simply, our company is the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been in this business now since 1986, and we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties around the world. We've got offices from coast to coast and more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do is for community associations, which includes all types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other types of residential communities, but we also have a great deal of experience with other property types such as office buildings, hotels, resort properties, worship facilities, and more. One thing I always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. We are not an engineering firm or an accounting firm, but rather a specialized consulting firm focused on doing one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that help those clients to forecast and budget for major projects. So if we do our job well and our clients follow the plans we help them design, they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and other forms of financial distress. If you'd like to get any additional information, please visit our website at www.reservestudy.com. or feel free to shoot me an email anytime. My email address is wsimons@reservestudy.com. That's WSIMONS@reservestudy.com. So here's what we're going to cover today. The course really just has these two sections. We'll spend a little bit of time in the beginning answering this basic question, what are reserves? And then we'll spend the majority of the class reviewing reserve studies and how those documents are used by community associations to make sure they're on the right track with regard to long-term planning. Along the way, we're going to look at some communities that weren't adequately funding so that you can see some real-world examples of what happens when reserves are ignored. So feel free to take notes as you go along. And without further delay, let's get started. Thank you. One last thing before we begin. I like to include this slide in every presentation that I give because I think it illustrates a really common reaction or mindset when it comes to long-term planning. What we see out there and what I'm sure you've seen amongst your community members is this reluctance to embrace the responsibility of long-term planning, right? I think this guy here represents a very typical attitude that we see when it comes to thinking about budgeting for reserves. If you look at this guy, he's got his eyes closed, his fingers crossed, somewhat of a kind of pained look on his face that might look familiar to you. So if there's one message that I'd like you all to remember from this class, it's that we all need to go out there to the communities that we work with and to help them get over this mindset. Okay, it's our responsibility, either as professionals in this field or even as volunteers working with our neighbors, to educate the people around us, to not let excuses get in the way, and to help the people that we serve to take good action and help provide for their communities. Okay, so we'll begin next by answering this first basic question. Again, what are reserves? For those of you who have been in the field for a while, this slide will be pretty elementary, but for those who might be newer to this profession, or if you're not used to drafting budgets, I think we'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about these two main aspects of any given association's budget. Basically, the budget can be categorized into two sections. You've got your operating funds and your reserve funds. So first we'll talk about the operating fund. Operating money is essentially there for the routine costs of running the business of the community association. These are going to be your daily, weekly, monthly types of expenses for things like utilities, insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, and so on. If you want to think of this in personal terms, you might think of the operating account sort of like your own personal checking account, right? Operating funds are unrestricted. That means that they can be spent on any bill, any expense that the association has to pay. And then, one thing that differentiates these from reserve funds is that operating money will be typically spent in the same year that you collect it, right? So what that means is that if you've designed a good budget, you shouldn't have any significant surplus or deficit at the end of the year. You typically will just spend all of the money that you've collected within the fiscal year that you've collected it. Okay. Now, on the other hand, you've got your reserve account. And your reserve account or accounts are there for the longer term expenses that the association will have to pay for. Some of these expenses may not occur for 5, 10, maybe even 25 years at a time, but when they do occur, those might be some of the biggest bills that the association will ever have to pay. Your reserve money is typically going to be spent on things like roof replacements, painting of buildings, pavement resurfacing, lots of other projects that we'll talk about later on. Another difference here between operating and reserve funds, of course, reserve funds are restricted. And what that means is that once you put $1 into a reserve account, it can only be spent on specific things, not on any random project or cost that the association is facing. Again, differentiating from operating, reserve money will tend to accumulate. You don't have to spend it in the same year that you collect it. Sometimes that might be accumulating for many, many years, building up the account balance until it needs to be spent for its intended purpose, whatever that might be. So going back to our analogy, in that way you might think of the reserve account more like a individual savings account. Okay. On this slide, I've included a very short excerpt from the Florida Statutes. Specifically, we're looking at a section of Statute 718, which is known as the Condo Statute. And what I've highlighted in red here is the portion of the text where they talk about what associations must be reserving for, specifically condo associations. And if you take a look over the section, the statute requires that condos reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they add in this one general definition at the end. Okay, so the 3 things they name specifically are going to be roof replacement, painting, and paving. And then the general sort of catch-all definition that they have at the end is, well, and for any other item with a replacement cost greater than $10,000. Okay. Now you might be wondering, why did they pick $10,000? And I've been teaching this class for many years. I've asked this question from many different audiences, and nobody has ever really given me a clear answer as to why the answer is $10,000. We don't know why it wasn't $1,000 or $25,000. Nobody really knows. My guess is that way back when they wrote the statute, they might have just picked a number that sounded high and said, yeah, let's go with that. But my point is that the $10,000 number is totally arbitrary. For many associations, if not most associations, that number is probably much too high of a threshold to set. Okay, as we'll talk about later in the class, a more appropriate way to look at that dollar amount should be in terms of what is a financially significant number to this association. Okay. On this slide, I've included a portion of the statute that pertains to HOAs. The HOA statute 720 actually has even less to say about what you should be reserving for in a community association. right? So unlike the condo statute, the HOA statute does not have any specific checklist of items that need to be included. Instead, pretty much all they say, the only guidance they give, is that there are certain things that the association is responsible for, and if you don't have reserves, then it might result in a special assessment. Now, okay, the good news is that there's actually a much more realistic and thorough way to go about defining what any association, whether it's condo or HOA, should be including in its reserve planning, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. For now, I just want you to keep this sort of basic definition in mind. Okay, reserve money is there for an association to save over a long period of time for major repair and replacement projects. Okay, now it's important to notice what I didn't say. Okay, I didn't say that you could spend reserve money on capital improvements, on paying a costly insurance deductible, or really for any other purpose. Okay, now let's just do a quick example. Let's say an association does not have a playground, but all of the residents really want to put in a playground. Now that might be a perfectly smart and worthwhile thing to do, but they, in that case, could not use their reserve money for that. What they're doing there is adding a new element to the association, which would have never been considered in any of their prior year's budgets. So any prior reserve contributions would have never taken the cost of that new playground into account. So again, in reality, it might be a great thing to do, but the initial expense would have to come out of some other fund, some other means. Now, going forward, after they have put in the playground, paying for it with some other type of money, once the playground is in place, then the association can start reserving for it and thinking of long-term replacement cycles for replacing the equipment, the swing sets, the fall surface, and so on. But that initial cost of installing the playground in the first place, that itself would not be eligible for reserves. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our first section, and a couple of times during this class I'm going to break things up a little bit and take you through what I fondly call our Hall of Shame. Okay, every single one of these pictures is an example of what can go wrong when associations are not properly funding their reserves. I've actually taken most of these photos myself. Some of them were provided by a few of our other staff members, but the truth is every one of these is a real-life client that we've worked with. Now, the reason I'm including these sections is not to make fun of these people or these communities or to kick them when they're down. I'm simply just using these as a cautionary tale. I want to show you what happens when communities don't take financial responsibility and don't think about the long-term consequences of their budgeting decisions. Okay, one of the key points that I'll make here, and which you're going to see recurring in some of these photos, is that reserve funding is not only about fixing what is broken. Okay, a very important concept you want to keep in mind is that property value can be greatly affected by the aesthetics of the common areas in a community. It's not enough to just ask whether something is functional or not. Instead, you should be asking, are we doing all we can to try to make this an attractive place to live, not only for our current owners, but for potential buyers in the future as well, right? So this first picture here you're looking at, it's a pretty nasty looking roof, obviously. I distinctly remember walking this roof and having to very carefully watch my steps so that I didn't flood my shoes with, I think what was a couple inches of standing water. So obviously this is not what flat roofs are intended to look like. If you just think about the weight of all that water for a moment, you can imagine the weight of that water pressing down on the roof surface. And of course, it's only a matter of time before the water eventually is going to find its way into the building. So certainly a problem that is probably many years overdue and definitely needs to be corrected immediately. Okay, this next one here, this is bad for a couple of reasons. Let me take you through this. What you're looking at here, this is called a mansard roof, which is an architectural style where the roof shingles are on the outer perimeter of the building. They're very steep. Okay. I remember taking this photo and looking up wondering whether I wanted to even get any closer to this building, right? It's, as I recall, a 3-story building, and you can easily imagine one of these shingles slipping loose just as somebody's walking underneath it. And remember, that could be anybody. That could be the mailman, could be a landscaper, could be somebody's grandchild. So not only are the shingles really not protecting the building anymore, not only that, they look terrible, and to me this is just an accident waiting to happen. Okay, what you've got here, this is a seawall, or what's left of it, that's clearly failed. This was a metal sheet pile seawall that essentially at this point is just turning to dust after a couple of decades of salt water and air exposure. I think at this point, if I remember correctly, that the client was just basically going to have to abandon this portion of the property and kind of let it go back to nature. So, all right, on this one, I would give the client here some credit for attempting to do the right thing, but unfortunately it's an example of too little too late. Okay, if you look closely, what you'll see in the photo is this advanced pattern of deterioration and cracking in the pavement that we call alligatoring, because it actually eventually just starts to look like an alligator's back. By any definition, this pavement is failed, but the additional mistake that the client made here was to try and just simply put new asphalt on top of the old deteriorated surface. To me, this was just throwing good money after bad, because whatever money they spent on the new layer, that was essentially a total waste. Like I said, you give them points for trying, but you can clearly see that the entire pattern of cracking reflecting upward through the surface is coming from what was there before. Probably started happening within just maybe a year or two of that new top layer being put down. All right, last one in this section for the time being. This one always kind of strikes me as funny because I'm not sure how you could ever let this get this bad, right? Let's say you're walking down the street in this community. Okay, now what are your options when you get to this point? Option A, you stumble off to the left in the photo and you end up in those bushes. Option B, you have to walk out into traffic to try and get around this section and get back on the sidewalk. But not only that, you know, obviously neither one of those good choice, but if you just keep in mind that the ADA standard definition of a trip hazard, okay, that's only a 1/4 inch rise in the concrete. So this is clearly, you know, way past that. Okay, we'll come back to our Hall of Shame in a moment, but I want to switch gears now and kind of get into the second portion of this class. Let's talk about reserve studies and how these documents are used by properties, by associations, when they prepare their annual budgets. Okay. First, I just want to establish the actual definition of a reserve study. Okay, this comes from National Reserve Study Standards. These standards have been in place now for over 20 years. They were adopted by CAI back in 1998. Basically, a reserve study is a tool or a document that does a couple of things. First, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund, and secondly, it provides a funding plan that gives you guidance about how to deal with those future expenditures. Now again, notice what I didn't say, what I did not say. A reserve study is not an insurance appraisal. It's not a turnover study. It's not an engineering report. It's a very particular document that contains some very specific content regarding the physical and financial elements of the community. There are 3 types of reserve studies. So if a property has never had one done before, then it needs to begin with what's called a full reserve study. In that type of study, the provider is creating everything totally from scratch. Okay, it involves a site inspection, which is going to involve taking measurements, taking photos, otherwise gathering up all of the raw data that will eventually become the component list for that property. But once you've had a full study done, from then on there are one of 2 types of update studies that can be done. The first type is called an update with site visit, and in that case a new site inspection is going to take place, but it will use the existing component list, just looking for any significant changes in life expectancies or cost estimates, updating everything based on the current conditions of the property at that point in time. There are some states that require these types of updates at specific intervals, but generally speaking, the best practice is to have one done at least every 3 years or so. Okay, the last type of study is what we call an update with no site visit, which is exactly what it sounds like. Still a whole new reserve study document, but instead of conducting a new inspection, in these cases the provider will be just corresponding with the board of directors, with the property manager, to find out what projects have taken place, what new information is available since the last time anybody was on site. Still a whole new financial analysis, new funding plan, but in this case based on just correspondence and data from the prior study whenever somebody was last on the property. Okay, there are 2 parts to a reserve study. These are called the physical analysis and the financial analysis. We'll get into both of these. The physical analysis portion of the study, this is where someone's actually coming out to do the site inspection. It's going to be a visual inspection of all the common areas of the property, but it includes everything from the roof to the mechanical rooms to the amenities to the lobby. Basically anything and everything that the association is responsible for needs to be evaluated. This involves taking lots of measurements, photos, documenting model numbers and serial numbers for equipment, doing whatever else it takes to gather up that raw data related to each component, which will eventually be used to determine its life expectancies and replacement costs. During this physical analysis portion, it's usually very worthwhile to try and meet with a representative from the property, whether that's a board member, a manager. The idea there is to try and collaborate with the people who live there, the people who are the representatives from that community, to gain from their insights and experience from having lived and worked there for, in some cases many years. Second part of the reserve study is what we call the financial analysis. This is the part where we take all that data back to the office, gather it up, organize it, and then start to analyze the findings, right? We'll start to research any particular costs or project history. We compare that information with our experience working with similar properties and basically start to fill in the gaps, try to start drawing some financial conclusions. Okay, there are 3 outcomes to a reserve study, and I'll go through these one at a time. First and foremost, the reserve study has to contain a component list. And the word component in this context really just means some instance where the association will be spending money. Okay, so a reserve component could be a roof replacement project, a swimming pool resurfacing, or even a lobby remodel. For each component, there are 3 key pieces of information that need to be determined. First, we need to determine the useful life of that component. What I mean by that is its overall lifespan, or how long it's going to be in place from start to finish, either from when it was originally installed or when it was most recently replaced, until that will need to be done again. The second estimate is its remaining useful life. Now that number is going to be determined relative to a certain point in time. For example, let's say you've got a component with a useful life of 10 years, and as of this fiscal year, it's 3 years old. In that case, you would say that, again, as of this fiscal year, its remaining useful life should be about 7 years. Okay. Now lastly, we need to come up with an estimate for replacement cost. I've been asked over the years if the word replacement is really important here. Does that particular word matter? Now to be clear, you don't always have to be fully replacing something to justify it as a reserve component. We could just as easily say upgrade, remodel, modernize, resurface, or something else. So I don't want you to get too hung up on the word choice. Instead, keep the focus on the need to spend money to keep a component providing some value to the association. Okay? All right, at this point you might be wondering how we go about determining what actually goes on the list. And we talked earlier about the Florida statutes and what they have to say with respect to reserve budgeting, but I want to give you a different approach. Okay? Most professional reserve study providers will be using this 4-part test. Okay, now this also comes from National Reserve Study Standards. What you get here is a more open-ended definition of what a reserve component should be, and the beauty of this 4-part test is that it can be applied to any different type of community. Okay, so instead of going into a project with some kind of predetermined checklist, we go in with open eyes. We're looking for anything on the property that might meet this criteria. Okay, so let's talk through these 4 parts one at a time. The first part, the first item on the list here, is that the component in question has to be the association's responsibility. That's pretty straightforward, right? An example of something that might fail this part of the test could be something like windows and doors in a condo building. I would say at least 99% of the time, the unit owners as individuals are going to be responsible for paying for replacement of their own windows and doors. So if that's the case, there's no need to include them in the association's funding plan. Another example could be an HOA where you've got roads that are maintained by the city or by the county, meaning there's no need to include any funding for road maintenance or repaving. Okay? The second part of the test here is that the component has to have a limited useful life. Now, in our world, we don't use the word forever, but if something should last indefinitely and there is no timeline where you would expect to replace it, then it really shouldn't be considered in your reserve plan. Okay, so as an example, you might think of something like the foundation or the structure of the building, the conduit inside the walls. These are things that really should last the life of the property, however long that is. And so therefore you're not going to be actively funding for their replacement. It's actually at that point more likely that some developer is going to come in and knock down the property and build something new than you would ever have to replace those things. Okay. All right, the third part of this test is maybe the most complicated. Okay, a component has to have a predictable remaining useful life in order for it to be appropriate to include it in the reserve plan. Now the key word here is predictable, and to be more specific, what I mean is predictability in terms of scope and frequency. Okay, if you can't reliably predict how much money you'll be spending on something or how often, then it's most likely not a good idea to handle it through reserves. Okay, let me give you an example. Many associations will ask us, can we include our insurance deductible as part of our reserve plan? It's a really big number and we're really scared that one day we'll have to pay that, so we want to list it as a reserve component and start saving up for it. Okay, our response to this is going to be, well, if we want to include it in your reserve plan, what should the useful life be, right? In other words, how often are you going to have to pay that deductible? And of course nobody knows. That's the whole reason you have insurance in the first place. These expenses come as a surprise. It's a result of some natural disaster, a hurricane, a fire, and you're going to try to make some arbitrary prediction about how often that might occur is really getting away from responsible planning. Now, that's not to say that we don't recommend that you have some kind of plan in place, okay? After all, this is Florida. There will certainly be more hurricanes over the years. The problem is that we just don't know how often or how severe, and so there's really no way for us to responsibly tell a client how often they'll have to pay that insurance deductible. In this case, normally what I'll tell them is that, hey, it might be a good idea to have some kind of third account for your association, right? You have your operating account for your routine expenses. You have your reserve account for all the components that meet the criteria we're talking about here. But in addition to those, maybe it's a good idea to establish some kind of emergency fund. That might even be an emergency line of credit that's available to the community in the event you have to pay that insurance deductible. Okay, so just to reiterate, the problem with listing it as a reserve component is that you're ultimately going to be basing your funding calculations off of the timeline of expenses. And if those expenses don't fall in line with the plan, then all of the calculations are going to be thrown off, right? Let's just say that we assume a useful life of 10 years for the payment of that insurance deductible. So you're assuming that you're going to get a major hurricane every 10 years on the dot. But what happens if you get 3 storms in a period of 5 years? Okay, now you're expecting your reserve account to be able to fund those costs each time. What happens in that case is that you're going to end up pulling money away from your other reserve components that do have a predictable lifespan, which is ultimately going to result in, a good chance you'll need special assessments to make up for those shortfalls. Okay. Now the last criteria on the list here, does this component represent a significant cost to the association? Okay. I showed you earlier the statutory number of $10,000, but again, that's an arbitrary amount. In our experience, for most associations, that threshold should be set much lower. Okay. The advantage to doing it that way is that, yes, you will have more components listed in your reserve schedule, but that will take the pressure off of the operating budget, which is otherwise going to have to absorb those costs when they come along. Okay? So think about a small association, right? It might have 6 projects that cost $5,000 each. Technically speaking, they would be in line with the statutes if they left those out of the reserve plan because they individually cost less than $10,000. But let's say that all 6 of those projects happen to occur around the same time. Well, collectively, that's now a total expense of $30,000 that they're going to have to try to squeeze into the operating budget. And you can imagine if cash flow is a little tight, now they might find themselves in a kind of a tough situation. However, if they had those listed in the reserve plan as reserve components, then they would have the ability to spend reserve money on those things, and hopefully that's less disruptive to the community. But the point here again is that there is no one number that will be appropriate for any and all associations. All right, on this slide here, I've drawn a little red bracket around the top 3 components, which are the only ones, again, specifically mentioned by the Florida statutes. But if you look down the rest of the list, you'll start to see a lot of other components that we routinely include in our reserve studies. I know the statute has this definition of anything else over $10,000, but the problem is that not all associations are aware of just how much things cost. So I want to give you an idea here what we might see for, a smaller, simpler townhome style community. Maybe there's 15 or 20 components on the list that meet that criteria, but if you start talking about something like a luxury high-rise condo or some other complicated property, it's very easy to get up to 50, 75, even 100 components or more. Okay. All right. Back to the Hall of Shame. I think this one pretty much speaks for itself. Obviously, this fence is hanging on by a thread, probably going to collapse the next time there's any significant wind event. Another fence one here. This is a fence around the perimeter of a pool deck. Okay, so this is an HOA community where you've got kids running around all over the place. I think it's about 4 feet tall or so, this section of the fencing. So yeah, just the right height for kids to try and jump over. But in that event, you can certainly imagine somebody ending up with a pretty nasty cut. Just because it's rusted through at this point doesn't mean the rest of the fence is in great shape either. Okay, now I want to put it this way. Obviously, this is an eyesore. So imagine if you're a realtor, right? You want to take a client out and give a tour of the community, and this is what your client sees when they get to the pool area. What does that say about the property, right? If the fence is deteriorating this dramatically, it's probably not very secure in the first place, and so it's probably not even doing a good job of keeping people out of the pool area, which again, if you've got young kids in the community, has to be a absolute priority. But again, thinking of this from a curb appeal standpoint, it certainly fails that test. It fails a security test. It's just not doing anything good for the community at this point. All right, this next one here, this is pretty interesting. What you're looking at here is a boiler that had actually caught on fire at some point. Luckily, the fire must have snuffed itself out before it blew up the boiler room and took a chunk of the property with it. The reason I include this one is because clearly this association wasn't doing a good job of routine inspections and preventive maintenance. In fact, in doing the reserve study inspection, we were the ones to actually discover this, and we had to go back and report it to the property manager, which clearly showed they weren't doing a good job of checking in on things very often, right? So again, if you're not doing the little things right, it's very, very hard to do the big things right. Okay, this last one here is a bit of a story to go with it. This is the bathroom at a clubhouse, and I'll never forget the experience walking into this building. First of all, it was padlocked from the outside, and from what I understand, pretty soon after our inspection, the building had to be totally condemned. But at the time, I was walking the property with a board member who was an original owner in the community. I believe it was built sometime in the 1980s. Talking with this lady, she told me that way back in the day, their community clubhouse happened to be kind of like the jewel of the neighborhood, right? It was the type of place where kids would have birthday parties. They would do a big New Year's Eve party. I think she said they even hosted a couple weddings. It was this great asset to the association and even to the neighborhood at large. But what happened over the years was that the residents wanted to focus on keeping the dues low and cutting from the budget wherever they could. And so eventually they stopped funding the reserves for the amenity areas. What happens next? Now they can't keep up with the maintenance costs for the clubhouse, and at that point it pretty much became a hideout for vagrants, for drug users, and you can see from the photo what that ended up looking like. So to me, this one was really sad because you saw the complete transformation of this building, right? It became it started as a great asset and eventually became a complete liability, eventually something they had to completely abandon and pay to demolish. So again, when people ask why they need to have reserves, this is one of the things that always kind of flashes into my mind. This is kind of the worst case scenario. Okay, back to the list of outcomes. Again, 3 outcomes in a reserve study. We already talked about the component list, but now let's switch gears and we'll talk about this notion of the evaluation of current reserve fund strength, which we often describe in terms of percent funded. Let me just break it down. One of the best ways that I found to explain percent funded is to use the analogy of a credit score. Okay, now we've all had our credit reports pulled. We should all know what our credit scores are. You know that to an outside party like a bank or a credit card company, your score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are. Okay, so in the same way, if you think of the reserve study itself like a credit report, but you have to distill it down to one key result, that would be percent funded. Okay, so just to give you context, we measure it on a 0 to 100% scale. And we consider anything between 0 and 30% funded to be a weak position. When you're in that range, the association has a much higher likelihood of special assessments and cash flow problems. But the good news, once you get above 30% funded, now that's more of a fair range. It's more of a moderate risk. You know, things are not an emergency anymore, but there's definitely some room for improvement. Where you really want to be, however, is above 70% funded. Right? That's where we've seen the very lowest risk of those types of cash flow problems. Okay, we've talked about percent funded as a concept, but now we can switch gears and talk about how it's actually calculated. Okay, so the idea here is pretty simple. All we're really doing is looking at how much money an association has at some point in time, and then comparing that amount against how much money it should have at the same point in time. We're just going to then express that comparison as a percentage. Okay, so the first part of the calculation, pretty straightforward, right? When we're doing a reserve study for a client, typically we're looking at their current financial statements and trying to look ahead to the start of the following fiscal year in order to know how much money they'll have at the beginning of that year. Okay, that's the easy part. Now the second part, how much money you should have. Okay, this is a concept that we call the fully funded balance. Okay, and we'll explain this one in more detail. The fully funded balance for a community is a theoretical number. Let me just make that point right off the bat. But the way I want to put this in perspective is to put it in the form of a question. Okay, if I told you that my association has $50,000 in reserves, okay, but I haven't told you anything else about the community, does that really mean anything? Have I told you anything at all? Okay. Now I hear this sort of thing all the time from board members, from some of our clients. Somebody might say, for example, hey, our association is in great shape. Okay, we have $900,000 in reserves. Okay, sounds great. But I have to point out to them that, yeah, that sounds like a lot of money, but we don't really know if that's adequate unless we have something else to compare it against. Okay, should be obvious that's going to depend on what type of property we're talking about, doesn't it? Okay, if I was working with a little 2-story building, something like this, no amenities, just a little parking lot, could be that $50,000 is plenty of money for them. But if I'm dealing with a luxury high-rise building, you can imagine that $50,000 might be just a drop in the bucket, right? That can be wiped out in one payment of one project. Okay, so let's take this one step further. Okay, how do we calculate the fully funded balance? And the idea is pretty simple. Basically, you just need to look at how old the component is compared to its overall lifespan, and that will give us a fraction. We then multiply that fraction by the current estimated cost of the component, which tells us how much money we should have today for its eventual replacement. Okay. So when we do a reserve study, it doesn't matter if the association has 4 components or 400. What we do is we calculate the theoretical fully funded balance for each one, for each component, and then we just add all those numbers together, and that will give us the combined fully funded balance for the whole association. Once we've done that, now we have something we can use to examine their actual cash on hand and put that number in perspective. All right. Let's just talk this through. Let's do an example together. So for the moment, let's all pretend that we're on the board or we're managing this property. We'll just call the Seaview condominiums. And our task now is to calculate percent funded for the association as of the start of our next fiscal year. Okay. Now that we've began to understand the concept, again, the first thing we have to do is establish the starting reserve balance. So let's say that we've reviewed our financial statements, we've looked into any projected spending that's going to happen this year, we know how much we're going to put into the account because of our budget, how much our budget calls for in terms of contributions. Let's say we've done all that math and we have this starting point. We're going to have 60 grand in the bank at the start of the next year. Okay, simple enough. Now, the next thing we have to do is calculate the fully funded balance to put that starting balance in perspective. And of course, the way we do that is by breaking it down and doing it on a component by component basis. Okay. For the sake of this example, I'm going to limit it to just 3 things. Okay. So first, let's take a look at the roof. Okay. Let's say our roof is 10 years old with an overall useful life of 20 years, and we'll give it a replacement cost of $80,000. Okay. Keep in mind that the fully funded balance is only the proportion of the cost that we need to have on hand today, theoretically. So since the roof is halfway through its life, we only really need to have half of the replacement cost saved up today, recognizing that we have the next 10 years to collect the difference. Okay, so if we put numbers to it, let's say we take 10 years over 20, we'll multiply that by $80,000, which tells us that the theoretical fully funded balance for the roof as of right now is $40,000, right? Again, it's halfway through its life, so you only need to have half of the replacement cost saved up today. Let's look at our next example. Let's say that we want to do the calculations for our gym equipment. Okay, if we assume that the equipment is 5 years old with an overall life expectancy of 15 years and a replacement cost of $30,000, then we know that the fully funded balance for that equipment right now should be $10,000, right? Makes sense. It's only a third of the way through its life, so we only theoretically need to have 1/3 of the replacement cost in the bank today. Let's do one more. Let's say that we painted the hallways of the building 2 years ago and we want to do that every 8 years. Okay, let's say the cost estimate is $100,000. So we'll take 2 divided by 8, so 1/4 or 25% of the way through its life. And if we have a cost estimate of $100,000, of course now we know that the fully funded balance for hallway painting would be 25 grand, right? Okay, not so bad. Now that we know our starting reserve balance and we've calculated the individual fully funded balances for each component, now we can calculate percent funded for the whole association, right? If we take the 3 numbers that we just calculated, we can add them together. So we're going to take $40,000 for the roof plus $10,000 for the gym equipment and $25,000 for painting. Adding those together, we get this theoretical fully funded balance of $75,000. And once we've done that, now we can look back at the actual $60,000 in cash that was on hand or projected to be on hand. We make a determination that the association is 80% funded. Okay. Before we move on from this section, I want to show you how we can begin to draw some financial conclusions about associations based on that level of percent funded. So what you're looking at here is the result of a huge internal analysis that we completed a number of years ago. In this case, we looked at a data set from thousands of associations and we were measuring for 2 variables. First, what was their level of percent funded? And secondly, yes or no, did we need to include a special assessment recommendation in the funding plan? And the results were pretty obvious and in line with what we would have expected. In short, the closer an association is to 0% funded, the higher the chances that they would need a special assessment immediately as part of their funding plan. Okay, no big surprise there. A few years later, we did another internal study, and this time we wanted to see whether there was any correlation between percent funded for associations and the actual property values of the homes within those communities. The way that we did this one was to look at a large data set from a big metropolitan area in Southern California. We selected a large group of properties that were all as similar as they could be in terms of size and age and amenities and so forth. We then measured the appraised market value of the homes in those communities to see what difference it made when the associations themselves were in a better financial position. So to be specific, what we wanted to know was what type of increase would we see when an association was in a better financial position with respect to percent funded. And the results were pretty interesting. First, we set this baseline of associations that were in a weak position, right? Those between 0 and 30% funded. And then we wanted to see what happens to property values when comparable associations were in a fair position, those between 30 and 70%. So again, all else being as equal as possible, what we found was that the communities that were in a fair position had units that were about 8% more valuable than the ones that were in their weaker counterparts. Okay. What was even more interesting was that when the associations were in the strong range, above 70% funded, we saw an almost 13% gain in property value compared to those that were in the weak position. So intuitively, you can see how that would be the case, but it's pretty obvious the associations that had money in the bank tended to have better curb appeal. They were in a better physical condition, which translates back into them being more attractive to potential buyers. Again, a higher demand for those units in the market. So if you go back to the first question, why have reserves? What are reserves? You know, kind of the underlying principle of this whole thing. The answer is that that will come back to you in the form of higher property values. Okay, one more quick trip through the Hall of Shame, starting with this one, a pretty nasty looking swimming pool. Again, obviously a case here where the association can barely even afford to treat the pool on a regular basis, much less resurface it or do anything else with the amenity areas to keep it in shape. You'll also notice the there's no furniture there, the diving boards have been removed, so this is essentially just kind of a pond at this point. Here we go. This is a unique property. This one had a huge tower in the center of the community that was comprised of many different amenity areas on each floor, but unfortunately the whole tower was essentially abandoned. They had an auditorium, a billiards room, card rooms, even a lounge, kind of like a sky lounge up on the top floor, but they all pretty much look like this. Okay, the building at this point had been abandoned for something like 10 years. Again, just a situation where there simply wasn't enough money in the bank to keep anything in good shape. This one here has got a bit of a story too. Okay, if any of you have ever gone through concrete restoration, then this might bring up some bad memories. This is the one photo that's actually not, luckily not a client of ours, but I walked by this one and I just had to stop and get this picture because this shows exactly what happens to concrete over time if you're not protecting it from the environment. This is about as close as I was willing to get, but you can see the picture, pretty much speaks for itself. Actually, if you remember, not too long ago, there was a building in Miami where a balcony actually sheared off the side of the building. I think it was a New Year's Eve party. There's maybe 6 or 8 people standing on the balcony at the time. Fortunately for them, it was only on the 2nd floor. But what happened there was the rebar structure that was holding it up essentially disintegrated over the time that it had no strength, led to a sudden collapse. The balcony and all the people on it fell onto a parked car right beneath it. Very, very lucky situation. Nobody was killed, but I do believe a couple people went to the hospital as a result of that. Now, ask yourself, how would you like to be on the board or managing that community the next day when you start getting those calls from the attorneys and people start asking what happened? Not a good situation. So, okay, we're almost ready to wrap up, but of course we've got one more outcome that we're going to talk about, which is the actual funding plan, right? So if you think of our first 2 outcomes, again, being the component list, in other words, what do you have, what's going into the plan? Outcome number 2, percent funded, where do you stand right now? You can think of this third outcome as where do you go from here? What is the consequence of those first 2 things? So the first thing we do when we design a funding plan, we're going to look at the current budget. How much is this community contributing to reserves now? Is that going to be sufficient over the long term? Second point here, that talking about the frequency of reserve contributions. What I mean here is that if you have a monthly dues amount, a monthly collection from the owners, that means you have to have a monthly reserve transfer. I think by statute it has to be done within 30 days. But the bigger point is that This is a proactive approach. You're not just reacting and hoping that at the end of the year you've got some surplus in your operating budget. You slide that over into your reserve account, pat yourself on the back, and say, yeah, we funded reserves this year. It doesn't work that way. That's like going back to the guy in the beginning with his eyes closed, his fingers crossed. You're just kind of hoping that that surplus will be there. That's not a substitute for an actual plan. Okay. There's a couple of key principles that we keep in mind, some criteria here when we're designing this plan that we'll talk about individually. First one, of course, being that you have to have sufficient cash, right? So as you look to the future, you're modeling your reserve expenditures over time. At the bare minimum, the amount of money that you put into reserves over that period of time needs to ensure that you have some amount of cash on hand at the end of each fiscal year. That's actually the bare minimum requirement, which is something that we call baseline funding, but it's pretty obvious. If you don't have any money in reserves, you're guaranteed to have special assessments or loans, which is one of the main things we're trying to prevent in the first place. Okay, the contribution rate to reserves also needs to be stable. What that means is that, for example, you can't have these huge spikes and decreases in the contribution rate over time based on some arbitrary fluctuations. It's not fair to assume that some future group of owners will be perfectly willing and able to double their reserve contribution rate overnight, making it easier on the owners who live there today, right? You can't just kick the can down the road. You're also not allowed to plug in any balloon contributions. So what that means, for example, let's say you've got a $1 million roof replacement project happening 10 years from now. Well, you can't just operate with the expectation that you'll raise $950,000 in the 9th year and avoid putting away any meaningful contributions between now and then, right? You can't get away with that. You also don't take years off. So what that means, for example, let's say you've just spent a huge amount of money modernizing your elevators, and because those have a long useful life, maybe you don't have to do that again for another 20, 25 years. That does not mean that you stop funding reserves for elevator modernization. It's going to happen again, and you should begin funding for it for the next time around, that is, as early as possible, so as to spread the cost of the component over the longest period of time possible. The idea is that your association membership should be paying for the deterioration of components over their entire useful life, not just all at once, right when something fails. When you do it that way, everyone pays their fair share, and it's not just a burden on the unlucky people who happen to live in the building when the life expectancy for some component expires. That's like playing a very nasty game of musical chairs, isn't it? All right, now the last but maybe the most important principle to follow when you're designing your reserve funding plan is that it's got to be fiscally responsible. So what do we mean by that? For example, that means being realistic with respect to interest and inflation. It's not realistic to assume that you can earn 10% interest each year on your invested reserve funds. You'd be, a Hall of Fame investor if you could make that happen. Unfortunately, we know that reserve money really can't be invested in anything very exciting, so that means you should be assuming a fairly low return on those funds. With respect to inflation, you should also be realistic and use a realistic number there. We found that historical data trends would support an average annual inflation rate of about 3%. Okay, so if you're assuming that the cost of a project 15 years from now will be the same as what it costs today, you're going to be way off, and whatever plan you come up with is just not going to work. The second point on the slide speaks to being honest about the situation that you're in. Okay, if your association has not historically done a good job of funding reserves, it is critical to address that. It's financially irresponsible to just continue operating the way you always have just to try to maintain the status quo. Let me point out, it's not the job of the board of directors to make owners happy or to keep the dues low compared to the building next door. All right. Speaking of the owners, your reserve funding plan cannot be biased in favor of the people who live there now at the expense of the people who will live there later on. Okay, you can't just assume that they'll pay the tab for you. This all takes place despite what may have happened up to now. We see it all the time where prior budgets weren't funding reserves, and now the associations in the present day have had the can kicked to them. But that's not an excuse that you can go ahead and kick the can on down the road for the next group of owners. It doesn't work that way. In a perfect world, look, all associations would have been managed carefully and guided over the years to some stable financial position, but in reality, that's usually not the case. However, that does not in any way remove the obligation from the board of directors to act responsibly and fulfill their fiduciary duty. Having said all that, at the end of the day, we recognize that this is a challenge for most communities. If an association has been operating for many years without funding properly, there's a good chance they'll be in a financial hole that will be really hard to climb out of. But it's important not to put lipstick on a pig, okay? The owners in those communities deserve to make an informed decision, and having a reserve study done is a great way to make that possible. They need to know that if the reserves aren't funded properly, the only logical conclusion will be special assessments and loans when things need to be done. So remember, the guy we saw in the beginning, eyes closed, fingers crossed, hoping for the best. I feel like if I've done my job here today, you'll agree that that mindset is not a substitute for a responsible financial plan. And I hope you've all learned some helpful information today that will benefit the communities that you serve. Thank you very much.